Welcome to the fake date debacle set in the Masterpiece Cuisine restaurant. Forced into a fake romance by a meddling committee, Mildred and Frank must put on a show. Their mechanical charade takes an unexpected turn after an unscripted kiss.
Inside Masterpiece Cuisine, the chandeliers cast a steady glow over the mahogany. Silverware clinks against china in a precise, rhythmic pulse. Mildred and Frank sit at their usual corner table, two figures anchored in a sea of noise. They are the primary targets tonight. A group of senior diners, known as the committee, begins their tactical shift. A chair is nudged 3 inches to the left. A napkin is slid across the tablecloth. Empty seats are dragged into position, closing the gap between the two tables. The committee moves with the practiced coordination of a military unit. "You two would be a perfect match," she declares, her voice cutting through the ambient hum. Mildred keeps her eyes fixed on the menu, her fingers tapping a sharp, impatient beat against the table. "I would rather date my blood pressure medication," she replies. Someone sends over a shared dessert, a sugary intrusion that lands between them like a challenge. Mildred stares at the plate, her jaw set. Mildred pushed the shared dessert aside with the tip of her knife. "We need a strategy," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the clinking silverware. Frank nodded, his gaze fixed on a group of diners hovering near the service station. "A performance," he agreed. "If we give them what they want, they might leave us alone." They drafted the terms in hushed, clipped sentences. Hand-holding only during dessert. 3 seconds of eye contact. Absolutely no pet names. It was a tactical maneuver, nothing more. Frank took a breath, reached across the table, and grabbed Mildred's hand. He held it with the stiffness of a bomb disposal technician, his fingers locked straight. Mildred hissed. "Relax your fingers," Frank leaned in, his jaw tight. "I am relaxed. This is my relaxed." Across the room, the group erupted into silent, delighted chaos. The committee watched the joined hands with the intensity of spectators at a sporting event, their heads leaning together in a flurry of whispers. They attempted to feed each other dessert, but the spoon wobbled, and a glob of mousse narrowly missed Mildred's nose. Yet, as the night deepened, the theatricality began to fray. Frank started a story about a disastrous fishing trip, his voice dropping the forced, romantic cadence. He described a boat that refused to start, and a rainstorm that soaked his gear. Mildred listened, and then she laughed. Frank stopped mid-sentence. The air between them shifted, growing heavy and still. The performance was no longer a shield. It was a mirror. The air between them grew thin, stripped of the rehearsed artifice. Frank watched the way Mildred held her teacup, her fingers steady and precise, and the performance simply dissolved. He leaned forward, the movement slow and deliberate, and pressed his lips against her cheek. The contact was brief, yet it pulled the oxygen from the table. Across the room, the restaurant went silent. A waiter stopped mid-stride. Forks froze in midair, suspended over half-eaten meals. The committee watched, breathless, their collective gaze fixed on the corner table. Frank pulled back, his eyes wide, his breath hitching in his chest. "That was in the script," he stammered, his voice cracking. Mildred did not blink. She stared at him, her expression unreadable, the mask of their fake romance completely gone. "We do not have a script," she replied. The words hung in the space between them, heavy and undeniable. The theatricality was dead, replaced by something fragile and terrifyingly real. "I did not mean to complicate things," he said. Mildred smirked, a small, knowing movement of her lips. "You have always been good at that." Without a word, she reached out and took his hand. Her grip was firm, devoid of the stiffness that had defined their earlier pact. There were no rules left to follow. Frank looked down at their joined hands, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. "Does this mean the arrangement has been updated?" Mildred raised an eyebrow. "Let us call it a revision." Across the room, the committee watched like satisfied wildlife observers. One leaned in and whispered, "Phase 2 begins." At the entrance, a new pair of unsuspecting diners was being seated. The game was far from over.